Everyone, thanks for coming to the last in our Brown Bag Lunch Seminar Series. In case you missed them, the 4 topics were chosen based on their application to environmental sciences. We realized that was a topic at Berkeley City College that many people were interested in, but we might not have course offerings in. So this was just a way to provide some information about what's going on in environmental sciences, the state of the field right now, and the last topic for today has to do with climate change. And there's been a lot of coverage in the news about this, and towards the end of the talk I'll give you some real world examples of what's going on right now. So you can't really talk about climate change without addressing microbial ecology. So the first part of the talk will address microbial ecology, what it is, and the importance of microbes. And I'll discuss nutrient cycling, so elemental cycling of nutrients throughout the atmosphere. And I'll cover primary producers, which are autotrophic microbes or plants that can fix CO2. And I'll cover 2 case studies involving permafrost. Some of you may or may not have heard of permafrost, but it's a hot topic right now. And I'll tell you exactly what it is towards the end of the talk. Okay, well, let's just get started on microbial ecology. So this is the study of microbes and their interactions with the environment. So that can cover a lot of different topics, a lot of different environments. A couple examples are quantifying sulfur oxidizers in a deep sea hydrothermal vent. So we know sulfur oxidizing bacteria live in the deepest depths of the ocean. We want to know what they're doing there. We can also determine biodiversity of prokaryotes in the human GI tract. So this covers many different topics from marine to human health. So we know that tens of thousands of bacteria colonize the human gut. We want to know, what are they doing there? What types of microbes are they? Which are healthy, which are unhealthy? What does a healthy human gut tract look like? Okay, we can also monitor the distribution of a specific gene in a specific environment. So that'll tell us the presence or absence of a gene from a certain bacteria. What does that mean? So there are different ways to go about solving these microbial ecology questions. The subject of these investigations can be applied or fundamental. The applied science would be driven by problems affecting society somehow. So that's what I do in my regular day job. I research ways to produce biofuels. So that's an applied science field where I can take my microbiology knowledge and use it to solve an environmental problem society may be facing. Or the flip side of that is fundamental science or basic science research. This is to advance the understanding of a particular process. So how does X do Z? How does that sulfur oxidizing bacteria metabolize sulfur? So just answering basic questions of life and society. So microbes are extremely important for mediating the transformation and recycling of the elements in nature. So they can metabolize carbon, sulfur, nitrogen, and other elements, which we can't do. They can also undergo cycling of toxic metals. So if you were here 2 sessions ago for the bioremediation talk, there are examples of bacteria that can degrade oil or large chain hydrocarbons that would otherwise sit polluting an environment somewhere. So we need microbes to cycle those elements in or out of our environment. And the biological, geological, and chemical processes work together to alter the fate and transport of the elements. These elements can move through different trophic levels, so from the smallest primary producer all the way up to humans and larger mammals, the elements will cycle between all the different organisms. And the impact is huge. It affects bioavailability of elements to higher organisms. And I'll explain that when we talk about primary producers. And they control the energy flow in marine environments. And using the GI tract example that I already mentioned, you can cycle nutrients within an organism. So within our human gut, there are bacteria that are cycling elements that we cannot metabolize. So they're helping us out there. One of the biggest nutrient cycles that we're interested in is the carbon cycle. So in this schematic diagram, we have carbon dioxide cycling from the atmosphere into the water, coming out of the ground, and just continuously cycles through this fixed loop. Can anybody tell me, why do we need carbon? Why is it so important?
For carbohydrates, for any organic molecules in our body, actually.
Absolutely.
The skeleton.
Yep. So carbon is essential for making a protein, and we need that. That's just one example of something that we need to live. So the carbon and nitrogen are the backbone of proteins that we use in our bodies. And all the carbon we're ever going to get is already here. So there's carbon on the planet is fixed primarily in rocks and sediments. But the long-term cycling of carbon from rocks is over thousands of year time period. So weather and erosion of rocks will degrade a rock and release carbon into, say, water. That carbon can then be taken up by a crustacean, say, and that carbon will be turned into its shell. When that organism dies, the shell falls to the bottom, the sediments, the ocean, and repeats this loop. So it's back to being a rock. It'll be weathered, formed again, taken up by either a microbe or a larger organism to live its life cycle. This term is biogeochemical cycling, refers to the biotic and abiotic cycling of the elements. So abiotic process would be without life intervening, so the weathering of rocks, and the biotic processes would involve microbes that can take up this carbon, for example. So the major pools of carbon are stored in oceans and sediments, and the major flux is alternating between the atmosphere and land. And all the other major nutrient cycles link in some way to the carbon cycle. So nitrogen, sulfur, elements like that, they're all intertwined into the carbon cycle. So to understand the carbon cycle, you have to understand some different ecosystems. So primary producers are an organism that uses light to synthesize new organic material from carbon dioxide. So it's not on here. What's one major primary producer that you can think of off the top of your head? Just shout it out. Plants. Yeah, big time. So on land, primary producers are going to be your plants. In oceans and waters, your primary producers are bacteria. So they can fix carbon dioxide, something we cannot do. We can't breathe CO2. And they use that carbon to integrate it into their biomass or their cellular backbone. And then you go up the food chain. So you have bacteria. DOM refers to dissolved organic matter. So that's detritus or decomposing biomass. Bacteria can take the carbon from that. They can take the carbon from the atmosphere, from CO2, and it cycles through the microbes in, say, the ocean. And then higher chain organisms can then feed on the primary producer. That carbon gets incorporated, and so on until you're moving up the food chain. So this is essential to human welfare for food production. So the plants that we eat are primary producers, but then we have, say, cows grazing on grass, and we eat the cows. So it goes up the food chain like that. And there are a couple different ways to measure primary production. So on land, we can harvest plants before and after the growing season. And we can measure the CO2 uptake or a variation in CO2 concentration. And over water, we can measure photosynthesis and respiration in the water samples. So the unit of measurement is grams of carbon per unit of area per unit of time. So it's a rate analysis, how much carbon is being fixed in a certain area over a certain length of time. So if you took a 1 liter bucket of water, you can measure primary production in that sample. And that's what people actually do this. They go out on research vessels into the ocean, take water samples or take sediment core samples, and you can measure the rates at different depths in the ocean. So obviously near the top of the water column, you have a lot more light, which could increase primary production, but you also have limiting factors, like other nutrients that would not necessarily be available at the top of the water column, competing for your resources to fix CO2. So there are a lot of different factors. This is a more in-depth depiction of the marine carbon cycle. I won't go into it too much since we covered the basics already, but CO2 can go in or out of the system, back and forth between water and the air. And the dissolved organic carbon or dissolved organic material is available for both the classic food chains or the higher organisms or the microbial food web, so the bacteria and microorganisms. This brings us to the topic of greenhouse gases. So we already know a little bit about nutrient cycling, right? We just covered the carbon cycle. But there are certain types of gases that are known as greenhouse gases. And these are gases in the atmosphere that absorb and emit radiation. And primary greenhouse gases are water vapor, carbon dioxide, which is probably the biggest one you've ever heard of, but also methane, nitrous oxide, and ozone. And methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas than CO2 is. So we're going to talk about methane a little bit later. So a balanced food web is important for maintenance of the biosphere. So cycling of the elements is a natural process. What happens to throw the natural process out of orbit? Why do we have climate change? Why are we worried about climate change and greenhouse gases? So what's one thing that happens in our society to throw the process out of whack? What was that?
Pollution?
Pollution, yeah. Okay. Name one type of pollution. How did you get to school today? Or cars. Okay. Car emissions is a big one. So this is a real picture of I-80 near the university exit. This is one of the more notorious traffic jams in the whole country, actually. So it gets backed up really badly on both sides of the interstate. What's another one? Methane? Yes. What is one way of producing methane?
Cars and rice?
I'll just call it industrial plants, but yes. So this is the Chevron factory in Richmond, California. I'm not saying, there's necessarily anything wrong with this. We need these processes to live comfortably in our society. We need cars. They're not going away anytime soon. And we need refined goods. That's the state of the world we live in. Now there's one major process. It's related to methane. I'd be very surprised if anyone knows.
Agriculture?
Agriculture is one. I'm going to skip ahead and tell you. I mentioned it earlier, but the thawing of the ground is a big factor, and the rest of my talk is going to have to do with what happens when the ground thaws in the Arctic. So a lot of carbon is stored in permafrost. And I mentioned this term at the beginning of the talk. Permafrost is a thick subsurface layer of soil that remains frozen throughout the year, occurring chiefly in polar regions. So this is a map. The North Pole is in the center. You can see the Arctic Ocean. And all the purple, or the darker colors of purple, is permanently frozen ground. And to be considered permafrost, it has to be frozen for at least 2 consecutive years. So this seasonally frozen ground will freeze and thaw every year. So that's kind of at the top, the active layer. So you'll have frozen ground in the Arctic that stays frozen in the winter, but in the summer months, the brief summer months when the air is warmer, that top layer of frozen ground will start to thaw. So we have 21 million square miles in the northern hemisphere is seasonally frozen ground. Then you have the upper sediments, which is variable depending on the temperature, so it can stay frozen more often than not. Then we have the deep sediments. So this is stable permafrost. It stays frozen basically forever. It was put there in the last ice age. So it's been frozen for a long, long time. This can even go down to 5,000 feet. So this is really deep underground. There is about 9 million square miles of this deep frozen permafrost. And we're talking about areas like Siberia, Alaska, Canadian Arctic, so way north. Now this frozen ground does affect Earth's weather and climate. The frozen soil, that deepest layer, and the middle layer will hold moisture. So water on the surface from the melting snow cannot get through the permafrost. So imagine just a big brick of ice. It acts like a concrete barrier. So when you have melting snow that cannot penetrate the ice, you get actual pools or wetlands or bogs in the summer months. So it leads to the creation of wetlands, which are important to the plants and animals that live in that area. So without that permafrost, the water or the snow would melt and the water would run off and create these dry zones, essentially deserts. And so the frozen ground affects the carbon cycle. So the soil normally releases carbon into the atmosphere. And if that soil is frozen, the carbon stays trapped. Okay, I'll give you the answer here. So there are bacteria that do live in permafrost. This was a recent scientific finding. And it was pretty surprising that you have bacteria that are living at these 0-degree temperatures. So when the soil thaws, you get a release of carbon. So this slide indicates the importance of decomposition, how it works. So after an organism dies, the plant and animal will decay. That process releases the methane, carbon dioxide, or other greenhouse gases. And the gases move through Earth's carbon cycle in a balance. So it's very steady over time, which we've seen for a long time now. The freezing will stop that decay. Some areas of permafrost are frozen for thousands of years. But what's happening now is if this permafrost thaws quickly, stored matter will release greenhouse gases quickly. And it's kind of a vicious cycle because methane being a potent greenhouse gas, if it gets released, it's actually going to speed up warming, which will lead to more thawing. So you cannot accurately measure these rates or how much the climate will change or how much methane will be released over a period of time. That's why on the next few slides we'll have a pretty wide estimate. And that's the reason for that. It's hard to pinpoint. So this is kind of the scenario we're facing. some effects of the warming on permafrost is that if the Earth's climate warms, the ground will warm. The permafrost may eventually thaw and disappear. The amount and thickness of seasonally frozen ground would decrease, which in turn would increase the size of the active layer, so that top layer. You'll get more pockets of unfrozen soil forming, and then the ground becomes weak, causing landslides. This is a big problem in Alaska right now. So you'll have just pockets of ground that thaw, and buildings can collapse, if there's a building on top of it. But you also don't want to build on top of thawing permafrost either, for that same reason. This is a nice diagram covering some of the topics I just mentioned. So methane trapped under the layers of rock or soil will be released when the permafrost thaws, and it releases a gas that is flammable. Methane is flammable. I think I have a movie, okay, not quite on the next slide, but there's going to be a really nice movie coming up. So this is a case study I've chosen to cover today, is permafrost in Siberia. So we already know that temperatures are warming faster in the Arctic than anywhere else on Earth. So it's twice the rate of the global average. Or, yeah. Northern Canada hasn't been this warm in 44,000 years. Now, last summer, I don't know if any of you read about this in the news, but giant mysterious craters were discovered by reindeer herders in Siberia. So they just happened along this giant crater, and they didn't know what it was. So Russian scientists investigated, and they found methane concentrations at the bottom of the hole that were thousands of times higher than regular atmosphere. So what happened? How did this hole get there? If you find a flammable gas at the bottom of a hole, and you have a big hole, what happened? Yeah, methane burst out of the ground. So recent studies estimate that continued warming would produce an additional, this is a wide range, 35 to 200 billion tons of carbon emissions within the next century. So we know the permafrost is already thawing, and it's really hard to slow down. We also know that the atmosphere is only able to hold another 400 billion tons of carbon before we get to a rise in 2% or 2 degrees Celsius of global temperature. So it would make dangerous impacts much more likely. And so these are all from April of this year. Siberia's permafrost is exploding, is Alaska's next. New giant crater appears in Siberia. Siberian sinkholes, scientists probing mystery run low on cash. Okay, what do they look like? These are huge, huge holes. So this is a person looking into the hole. It's giant. So that was one from last year. And here's another one. There's people there. These are ginormous craters. Okay, so could this happen in Alaska? The answer is yes. So there's a lot of research being conducted at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks. They estimate that methane concentrations will increase tenfold in the coming years. And this is a picture of the sinkholes that are developing underneath the ground, causing some destruction. And I have a 2-minute video that I'm going to play. It just loads.
We're out standing on a frozen lake in interior Alaska, outside of the University of Alaska Fairbanks campus. And this ice is already about 20 centimeters thick. So as it's been freezing up, methane gas has been coming out of the bottom of the lake and getting trapped in the lake ice. If you look at the shore, you can see that there are lots of trees that are falling in the lake and they're dying. What's happening is the permafrost is thawing. And the ice that was in the ground, when it melts, causes the ground surface to collapse. When the forest falls in and any organic matter, dead plant and animal remains that were in the permafrost, thaw out in the bottom of the lake. Microbes decompose it, and it generates methane. And methane doesn't like to stay in water in solution. It forms bubbles, and those bubbles make their way to the surface. In the summertime, the bubbles pop and they enter the atmosphere. In the winter, however, this ice forms a cover on the surface of the lake, and the bubbles get trapped right under the ice, and then the ice thickens and freezes around them. And so what we have out here is like a time-lapse photograph of methane emissions from the lakes. Methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. A molecule of methane is 25 times stronger than carbon dioxide. Methane is formed in millions of lakes around the Arctic where permafrost is thawing. And each year, these lakes are emitting already tremendous amounts of methane. But when we look at how much carbon is in permafrost still frozen, and the potential for that permafrost to thaw in the future, we estimate that more than 10 times the amount of methane that's right now in the atmosphere will come out of these lakes.
Still a hot topic in the field of science. So this, if any of you are familiar with NPR, every Friday they have Science Friday, and they bring on scientists to talk about different topics. This was from last Friday. Janet Jansen is the forefront of this field. She's now a division director at Pacific Northwest National Lab. So she covered, the topic of Arctic permafrost thawing and how microbes contribute to that. So this is a picture of one of those bogs that form, and you see the trees falling because they're losing the support from the frozen ground. Okay, so this I'm going to be wrapping up here soon, so all is not lost. I don't want to depress everyone. So there are simple things you can do right now, today, at home, and on the road. It might seem small, but it's not, because every little bit helps. So the simplest thing you can do at home, if you haven't done so already, is to replace your light bulbs with compact fluorescent bulbs or these Energy Star lighting. It'll say Energy Star on the box. So it generates 75% less heat, uses 75% less energy, and lasts 10 to 50 times longer. And on the road, of course, you can ride your bike or use public transportation whenever possible. If you're in the market for a new car, buy a fuel-efficient, low greenhouse gas vehicle. To improve your fuel economy, you can go easy on the brakes and the acceleration, reduce idling, or reduce the weight in your car, so take things out of your trunk. And they might seem small, but you want to properly inflate your tires, so it'll give you better gas mileage, but also help reduce emissions. And since this is a career-oriented seminar series, I want to mention some areas where you could possibly look for jobs. So the first and probably most obvious is the environmental science technician. You could do that job right now after graduating Berkeley City College. You would monitor the environment, go out into the field, collect samples, be involved that way. You can go the consulting route where you help with permitting and regulation. And then this kind of state of the industry right now, the car industry, of course, is trying to make lighter, more fuel-efficient cars. And the tech industry is, they're coming out with great new products from Nest or Canary, these home monitoring systems, or smart home products, how to get better efficiency out of, say, your thermostat, or lighting, or insulation even. Okay, I think, two more slides. So tomorrow is Earth Day. I'll just throw that out there. So, and this is a reminder to conserve water. We're in a drought. Check your faucets and pipes for leaks. Don't use the toilet as a waste basket. Don't throw anything down the toilet that's not supposed to go down there, because it uses a lot more water to clean up after that. You can install water-saving shower heads. Turn the water off after wetting your toothbrush. I'm notoriously bad at doing that, but I'm working on it. And turn off the water while you're washing dishes, of course. And Bike to Work Day is May 14th. You can learn more at www.bikeeastbay.org. They have stations set up all over the East Bay where if you ride past one of these stations, you get lots of goodies, tote bag and coupons and things. And one last slide to put you in a good mood before we leave. This is a new species of glass frog was found in Costa Rica, and they're calling it Kermit the Frog doppelganger. So it's the first glass frog found in Costa Rica, a new species of glass frog found in Costa Rica since 1973, and he looks like Kermit. So just wanted to leave you with that. And I'll answer any questions. I'll try to answer any questions you have. Okay.
Well, actually, we know from chemistry that any alkane, when it burns, it gives carbon dioxide and water. Did they try to just like burn the methane because they said carbon dioxide?
I think that's true, but I don't think you can go around to all of Siberia and do it. But yeah, on a small scale, burn it or capture it somehow and use it in an industrial process. So on a lot of agricultural farming, they use the methane that's produced from their cows, capture it, burn it to run their factory. That would be great.
Any more question? I'm sorry about that, I cannot be here. This is what, the last?
This is the last of the 4 sessions.
Anyway, on behalf of the science department, I want to thank Jennifer
And thanks for having me, and we really just wanted a way to communicate some different areas or topics of interest in environmental science. So even if you're not a scientist or pursuing a scientific career, hopefully you learn something about your natural environment, and just stay curious, and we'll see you next time.